A poor girl trapped in the cold CEO's marriage deal uncovered the confession that ruined his dynasty. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Emily Carter never imagined that a single signature could feel heavier than the January air pressing against her lungs. The kind of cold that slips through wool coats and settles deep in your bones. The kind measured in single-digit Fahrenheit mornings that make the city seem quieter than usual, as if even the traffic knows to hold its breath. And as she stood in the marble lobby of Whitmore Holdings with her borrowed heels planted on a floor polished enough to reflect her uncertainty, she realized this wasn't just a building. It was a boundary between the life she knew and the one she was about to enter. A place where power hummed softly behind glass walls and private elevators, where decisions were made that moved markets by miles and fortunes by millions. And at the center of it all was Alexander Whitmore, the CEO, whose name carried weight like a loaded vault, a man known for a voice that never rose, eyes that never warmed, and a reputation for control so absolute it bordered on legend, the kind of man who could make a room feel 10 degrees colder just by stepping inside. And yet here he was, standing across from Emily in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and money, offering a deal so precise it sounded rehearsed. Marriage without love, loyalty without intimacy. A partnership defined by clauses and timelines rather than feelings. And as he spoke, calmly, efficiently, like he was approving a quarterly report, Emily felt the floor tilt beneath her. Because this wasn't a fairy tale proposal, it was a transaction designed to protect a dynasty, and she was the variable that made it possible. The poor girl with no safety net, no inheritance, no powerful last name, just overdue bills, a mother's medical letters folded in her bag, and a clock that refused to slow down. And the hook, the moment that would pull her past the point of no return, came not from his authority but from his certainty. The way Alex slid the contract across the table with a pen already uncapped, as if the outcome had been decided long before she walked in. And that was when Emily understood the real danger wasn't marrying a cold CO. It was what might be hidden beneath the silence of a man who never explained himself. Because empires are not built on honesty alone, and dynasties rarely survive without secrets. And somewhere between the fine print and the promise of security, Emily sensed a fault line, a truth buried deep within Whitmore Holdings that could fracture everything if uncovered. A truth that would one day force a confession powerful enough to shake boardrooms, headlines, and a legacy generations in the making. But in that moment, with the pen hovering inches from paper and the city outside stretching for miles in steel and glass, all she could feel was the weight of the choice before her, the cold of the room, and the quiet certainty that once she stepped into Alexander Whitmore's world, there would be no easy way back. The pen felt colder than the room when Emily finally picked it up, not because of the metal, but because of what it represented, a line she could not uncross once her name touched paper. And yet the truth was she had already been cornered long before she ever walked into Whitmore Holdings, long before Alexander Whitmore looked at her like she was a solvable problem. Because outside that tower of glass and power waited a life that had been quietly collapsing one bill at a time, her rent 3 months behind. The final notice taped crookedly to her apartment door, the heating company's warning blinking red in her voicemail, and her mother's thin handwriting filling envelopes that smelled faintly of antiseptic, letters that talked about treatment schedules, insurance gaps, and the polite way hospitals ask for money they know you do not have. And Emily had tried everything before this, double shifts at the diner, selling old furniture online for a few dollars at a time, walking 3 miles instead of paying for a bus pass, counting grocery items down to the cent, but effort did not change math, and math said she was running out of days. And that was the part Alexander had understood without asking. The reason his offer landed so cleanly, so precisely, because it did not threaten her with force or cruelty. It simply removed every other option. And when he spoke again, his voice calm and even, explaining what the contract would cover: housing, a monthly allowance, medical expenses routed quietly through a foundation account, her mind filled with numbers she had memorized from overdue statements, figures that had haunted her sleep, and she hated herself for calculating how many nights of panic this deal could erase, how many phone calls she would no longer dread answering. And in that moment the marriage stopped sounding like a prison and started sounding like oxygen, limited, conditional, but necessary. And still she hesitated, because accepting meant becoming invisible in a different way, no longer poor but no longer free, defined by clauses instead of circumstances. And Alex noticed that pause, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not with anger but with assessment, and he leaned back, folding his hands as if giving her space while quietly controlling the room, reminding her without words that time was something he owned, not her. And he said, very softly, that he did not expect gratitude, did not want affection, did not even require her agreement beyond the signature. Only discretion, loyalty to the arrangement, and silence where his family was concerned. And it was that last part that settled uneasily in her chest, because silence is rarely demanded without reason. And yet Emily nodded, because she was tired of choosing between dignity and survival, tired of pretending pride paid interest. And as she signed her name, neat and careful, she told herself this was temporary, a calculated sacrifice, 2 years, maybe less, a bridge to something stable, something real. And the irony was she believed the danger lay in pretending to love a man who felt nothing, not in discovering what he was hiding. And when she handed the pen back, Alexander Whitmore stood, extending his hand not like a groom, but like a man closing a deal, his grip firm, brief, professional. And as she shook it she felt the last fragile pieces of her old life slip away, replaced by something colder, larger, and far more complicated than she had imagined. A world where comfort came at the cost of questions, and where saying yes today meant inheriting consequences she could not yet see, because the reason she could not refuse the marriage was never just money. It was time, time bought at a price she did not yet understand, time that would one day demand repayment in truth. The contract did not end with her signature. It only began there, because once the ink dried, the rules followed, delivered not as threats, but as structure. And Emily listened as a legal advisor reviewed each clause in a voice so neutral, it could have been reading weather data, timelines measured in months, expectations measured in behavior, appearances scheduled like board meetings, public events, charity galas, shareholder dinners, controlled smiles and rehearsed answers. All of it framed as necessary to preserve stability. And Alex stood nearby, silent, observing, letting the machinery of his world speak for him. And the most unsettling part was not what the contract demanded, but what it forbade. No emotional entanglement, no interference with corporate affairs, no questions regarding past acquisitions or family decisions, and above all, discretion, a word repeated so often it echoed. And Emily realized this marriage was less about creating something new and more about containing something old, something fragile. And when the ring was placed in her palm it felt heavier than she expected. A simple band, elegant, expensive, chosen for symbolism rather than sentiment. And as she slipped it onto her finger, she felt no rush of romance, only the strange awareness that her body had become part of a narrative larger than herself. A visual statement to the world that Whitmore Holdings was secure, unified, untouchable. And later that evening, as she was driven across the city in a car that smelled faintly of leather and quiet authority, Emily watched familiar streets blur past the tinted windows, the diner where she used to work late shifts, the laundromat where she once counted quarters twice, the apartment building she had not yet told her landlord she would be leaving. And with every mile she felt further removed from the person she had been that morning, replaced by a role she had not auditioned for, but could not decline. And the penthouse greeted her with silence. Not warmth, not welcome, but space. Wide open rooms measured in square feet, she could not mentally calculate, ceilings high enough to swallow sound. And Alex showed her around with polite efficiency, explaining which areas were shared, which were private, which doors required notice, which did not. And the rules followed them like shadows. No unexpected guests, no personal statements to the press, no deviations from the schedule without coordination. And Emily nodded, absorbing it all, because understanding was safer than resistance. And later, alone in the bedroom assigned to her, she sat on the edge of a bed, that felt untouched, pristine, and she held her hand up to the light, studying the ring again, realizing how quickly comfort had replaced panic, how easily stability could feel like relief, and that frightened her more than the marriage itself, because relief makes silence tempting, and silence makes complicity possible, and she thought about the clause that mentioned family matters, the careful wording that excluded details while emphasizing loyalty, and she wondered what kind of empire required such precision, such control over perception. And somewhere beyond the glass walls of the penthouse, the city continued as it always had, unaware that a deal had just been sealed, not only binding a poor girl to a cold CO, but quietly setting the stage for truths that had been buried beneath years of polished statements and strategic smiles, truths that would not remain silent forever, no matter how carefully the rules had been written. The wedding arrived faster than Emily expected, scheduled with the same efficiency as a corporate filing. And when the morning came, it felt less like a milestone and more like an appointment she could not miss. The city still wrapped in winter gray as she stood in a quiet suite overlooking the river, a stylist adjusting her hair with careful hands while a coordinator spoke softly about timing, entrances, exits, all measured in minutes, not feelings, and Emily watched her reflection with a distant calm, noting how different she looked already, composed, polished, dressed in fabric that cost more than a year of her old rent, and yet beneath it she was the same woman who had learned to survive by planning 3 steps ahead. And when she arrived at the private venue, a refined space reserved for discretion rather than celebration, the air felt still, as if the walls themselves had signed non-disclosure agreements. And Alexander Whitmore was already there, standing straight, dark, suit perfectly fitted, expression unreadable, a man prepared for scrutiny, but not sentiment. And as the officiant began, speaking words about partnership and commitment that sounded borrowed and distant, Emily focused on breathing evenly, reminding herself this was not a promise of love but a fulfillment of terms. And when it came time to exchange rings, Alex slid the band onto her finger with a controlled gentleness, his touch brief, precise, respectful, like sealing a document, and the cameras clicked softly, capturing images that would later circulate as proof of stability, unity, success. And Emily smiled when expected, a measured curve of the lips she had practiced in the mirror, while inside she noted how quiet it felt, how a wedding without joy still carried weight. And after the ceremony, during the brief reception where conversations stayed polite and surface level, she met members of the Whitmore family, their greetings courteous but cool, eyes assessing her value not as a person, but as a solution, and she sensed unspoken questions hovering behind every glance, questions about why her, why now, and what had required such an arrangement. And Alex remained close without being intimate, guiding her through introductions, correcting a name here, offering a small nod there, a partnership defined by proximity rather than connection. And later, as they left together, stepping into a waiting car, Emily felt the shift settle fully, the moment when her private struggle became a public symbol. And as the city lights slid past once more, she realized how completely the ceremony had changed her position without changing her power, because marriage had given her access but not authority, visibility but not voice. And when they returned to the penthouse, the silence greeted them again, heavier now with expectation, and Alex spoke first, his tone even, thanking her for handling the day well, for understanding the importance of perception, and she nodded, acknowledging the professionalism of it all. And in that exchange, brief and restrained, Emily understood the nature of what she had entered, a marriage built not on affection but on alignment, one that asked her to perform stability while remaining emotionally distant. And as she removed the wedding dress later that night, carefully hanging it back where it belonged, she caught sight of the ring once more, gleaming under soft light. And she felt a strange resolve settle in her chest, because if this was to be her role, she would play it with integrity, observing, learning, paying attention to the spaces between words, the silences that spoke louder than vows. And she sensed that beneath the polished surface of the Whitmore dynasty, beneath the controlled smiles and perfect timing, there was a story waiting to be uncovered. And though she did not yet know its shape, she knew one thing with certainty: this marriage was not the end of her struggle. It was the beginning of her awareness. Life inside the Whitmore penthouse settled into a rhythm that felt rehearsed, mornings marked by quiet efficiency, evenings shaped by schedules rather than impulse. And Emily learned quickly that her new world operated on unspoken hierarchies, where staff moved smoothly without being seen, and conversations paused the moment Alex entered a room, and she observed it all with careful attention. Because attention was the one thing the contract had not restricted, and each day she navigated her role as Mrs. Whitmore with polite precision, attending luncheons, responding to messages prepared by public relations teams, smiling beside Alex in photographs that framed them as effortless, united, untouchable. While privately she studied the details others overlooked, the way certain names caused tension to flicker across Alex's face, the way phone calls ended abruptly when she stepped closer, the way family dinners remained formal, measured, avoiding any mention of the past. And though the comfort of stability had eased her immediate fears, Emily could not ignore the subtle pressure that came with it. The sense that she was being positioned rather than included, placed carefully within a structure designed long before she arrived. And as days turned into weeks, she began to understand her function more clearly. She was not there to be loved. She was there to be believed in, to embody reassurance for investors, for board members, for a family whose legacy depended on appearing unfractured. And yet despite the emotional distance, Alex remained consistently respectful, never raising his voice, never crossing boundaries, treating her not as property, but as an ally whose cooperation was assumed rather than demanded. And it was that assumption that unsettled her most, because it implied trust without transparency. And one evening, during a quiet dinner where the city lights stretched for miles beyond the windows, Emily asked a simple question about a foundation mentioned in a news article, her tone casual, curious. And Alex paused just long enough for the silence to become noticeable, before answering with a vague explanation about restructuring and timing, his voice calm but guarded, and she nodded, accepting the surface answer. But the pause stayed with her, echoing the way certain topics seemed wrapped in invisible barriers. And later that night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the study, a room she had been told was shared but rarely used. And there she noticed files arranged with meticulous order, labels referencing years before she had met Alex, before the current empire had reached its height. And though she did not touch them, she sensed their weight, the way history lingered behind closed folders. And Emily realized that the contract had been precise for a reason, not only to protect assets, but to control narratives. And as she returned to her room, she thought about how easily comfort could distract from curiosity, how the relief of paid bills and secure walls could dull the instinct to question. And she promised herself she would not let that happen, because if she was to play this role, she would do so with awareness. And the following day, during a charity event hosted by Whitmore Holdings, Emily found herself speaking with longtime associates, listening as they praised Alex's leadership, his decisiveness during a critical acquisition years ago, an acquisition that had apparently saved the company from collapse. And as she smiled and nodded, she noted how often the story was repeated, polished, identical in every retelling, as if deviation were discouraged. And it struck her then that stability was not just the goal of this marriage. It was the shield protecting a carefully constructed version of the past. And Emily felt a shift within herself, a quiet resolve forming, because she understood now that her presence had given her access not only to privilege, but to perspective. And while she had entered this arrangement to survive, she was beginning to see that survival could lead to responsibility. And as she stood beside Alex later that evening, his hand resting lightly at her back for the cameras, she realized that beneath the calm exterior of their partnership, beneath the measured smiles and rehearsed moments, something was waiting to be uncovered. And whatever it was, it had shaped the Whitmore dynasty far more than any contract ever could. The first true test of Emily's place in Alex's world came at a formal gala hosted at the Whitmore Museum, a public event meant to reaffirm confidence after a volatile quarter. And from the moment she stepped onto the marble floor beneath chandeliers worth more than entire homes, she felt the weight of expectation settle onto her shoulders, because tonight she was not simply accompanying the CEO, she was part of the message. And as cameras flashed and executives gathered in tailored suits and understated gowns, Emily moved beside Alex with measured ease, listening more than speaking, watching how conversations shifted when they approached, how respect followed him like gravity, and when an unexpected issue arose, a scheduling conflict that threatened to delay a key donor presentation, Emily found herself stepping forward without thinking, calmly coordinating with staff, offering reassurance, redirecting attention with a grace born not of training but of necessity, because she had learned long ago how to solve problems quietly, efficiently, without asking for permission. And Alex noticed, his gaze sharpening not with control but with interest, and as the evening continued, whispers began to circulate, subtle comments about how composed she was, how naturally she fit, and for the first time Emily sensed the perception of her shifting, from temporary accessory to capable presence. And later, as they stood near a balcony overlooking the city, the night air cool against her skin, Alex spoke softly, thanking her for intervening, admitting the situation could have reflected poorly if mishandled, and his words were simple, unembellished, but they carried weight, because acknowledgement from him was rare, and Emily replied honestly, explaining that managing chaos had been part of her life long before penthouses and galas, and for a brief moment, the space between them felt different, not warmer exactly, but less rigid, and that small shift stayed with her as the night ended, reinforcing her sense that she was more than a placeholder. She was becoming a participant, and participation came with awareness, and days later, that awareness deepened when Emily was invited to sit in on a philanthropic board meeting, a symbolic gesture meant to highlight her involvement, and as discussions unfolded about grants, community investments, and the company's public image, she noticed inconsistencies, figures adjusted without explanation, references to past initiatives that no longer existed, and again that familiar tightening in Alex's posture when certain years were mentioned, and Emily did not interrupt, did not challenge, but she listened carefully, storing details, because survival had taught her the value of memory, and afterward, as they rode home in silence, she realized that the more she proved herself useful, the more she was trusted with proximity, and proximity revealed patterns, and patterns hinted at history. And that night, unable to ignore the growing questions, Emily searched public records, old articles, archived reports available to anyone patient enough to look, and she found gaps, stories that ended abruptly, acquisitions praised without scrutiny, companies absorbed and erased, all tied to a narrow window of time when Whitmore Holdings had surged unexpectedly. And Emily leaned back in her chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes, understanding now that her role had quietly expanded beyond appearances, and though the contract had forbidden interference, it had not forbidden knowledge, and knowledge was accumulating, piece by piece, and as she prepared for bed, she caught her reflection once more, the ring still catching light, and she felt neither trapped nor triumphant, but alert, because the world she had entered rewarded silence but feared observation, and Emily Carter had always been observant, and somewhere beneath the polished narratives and carefully managed events, she sensed the presence of a truth powerful enough to reshape everything, a truth that would not stay buried simply because it was inconvenient, and she knew that when it surfaced, it would test not only the Whitmore dynasty, but the boundaries of the marriage itself, because loyalty built on contracts could not withstand the weight of conscience forever. The shift between them became noticeable in the quiet moments rather than the public ones, in the pauses that lingered after conversations ended, and the way Alex no longer retreated entirely behind his routines. And one evening, after a long day of meetings that left the penthouse unusually still, Emily found Alex standing by the window, jacket off, tie loosened. The city spread beneath him like a map of decisions already made, and when she asked if he wanted dinner, he surprised her by answering honestly, saying he was not hungry, that he had spent too many years feeding expectations instead of himself, and she sat nearby without pressing, because she understood restraint, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was contemplative, and then, without turning to face her, Alex began to speak. Not as the CEO addressing a partner, but as a man acknowledging a crack in the structure he had built, and he told her that the pressure of legacy had never eased, that every choice he made was measured against a family name that demanded growth without error, strength without hesitation, and that the acquisition everyone praised had come at a cost he did not discuss, because discussing it would unravel the narrative that kept the company stable, and Emily listened, sensing that this was not a confession but a prelude, a careful step toward vulnerability. And he admitted that trust had never come easily to him, that alliances were formed out of necessity rather than affection, and that the marriage, as transactional as it was, had been designed to simplify a life that had grown too complex. And Emily responded gently, sharing that simplicity was rarely found through control, that sometimes it emerged through honesty, even when honesty complicated things. And he looked at her then, really looked, not with assessment, but with curiosity. And in that gaze she saw the weight he carried, the isolation of leadership that required constant vigilance. And he spoke about his mother, how she had valued appearances above all else, how she taught him that stability was the highest virtue, even if it meant swallowing doubt. And Emily understood then why silence was so carefully guarded in this family, because silence preserved the image that had protected them for generations. And she asked, quietly, whether the stability he protected still served him, or whether it had begun to imprison him. And Alex did not answer immediately, but the question lingered between them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, admitting that the world he controlled often felt smaller than the one he observed from afar. That power narrowed his choices instead of expanding them. And Emily felt a subtle shift within herself, because this was the man beneath the contract, the one who understood the cost of maintaining a dynasty but had not yet decided whether it was worth paying forever. And she did not press for more, did not ask about the gaps she had noticed, because she sensed that pushing now would close the door he had just cracked open. And instead she thanked him for trusting her with the truth he had shared, however incomplete. And that night, as they retreated to separate rooms as they always did, Emily lay awake thinking about the line between empathy and complicity, about how understanding someone did not absolve their actions, and how easily proximity could blur judgment. And she resolved to hold both truths at once, to see Alex as a person shaped by pressure and as a leader accountable for his decisions. And somewhere in the quiet of the penthouse, she sensed that this moment of honesty was not an end but a turning point. Because once a man admits the weight of his silence, he can no longer pretend it does not exist. And Emily knew that whatever truth lay beneath the polished legacy of Whitmore Holdings, it would not remain untouched now that awareness had entered the room, because silence had begun to lose its hold, replaced by questions that could not be unasked. And a marriage that had started as a deal was slowly becoming a mirror neither of them could avoid. Emily did not intend to investigate, not at first, because intention implies ambition, and ambition was dangerous in a house built on restraint. But discovery rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as coincidence. And for Emily, it came one afternoon when she was asked to retrieve documents from the lower archive for a philanthropic briefing, a routine task meant to keep her occupied. And as she descended into the quieter floors of the building, where the air felt cooler and the lighting less forgiving, she noticed a set of boxes labeled with dates that matched the narrow window she had been circling in her mind. The years when Whitmore Holdings had transformed from a respected firm into a dominant force. And though she told herself to stay focused, curiosity nudged her closer, because curiosity had always been her survival instinct, the habit that kept her alert when circumstances shifted without warning. And inside one box, she found meeting minutes stamped confidential, language carefully neutral, references to accelerated approvals, emergency decisions, risk mitigation measures that read like caution wrapped in confidence. And she felt a tightening in her chest, not fear, but recognition, because she had seen this kind of language before in letters that avoided responsibility while implying necessity. And she did not take anything, did not copy or photograph. She simply read, memorizing names, phrases, patterns. And when she returned upstairs, her mind felt heavier, weighed down by the knowledge that what she had sensed was not imagination, it was structure. And over the following days, pieces began to connect, comments made at events, articles archived and quietly amended, charitable contributions that coincided with legal settlements no longer searchable. And Emily understood then that the Whitmore dynasty had not merely survived a crisis. It had absorbed it, reshaped it, and buried its consequences beneath layers of success. And this realization did not come with anger. It came with clarity, because clarity strips away the comfort of ignorance. and she found herself watching Alex differently, not with suspicion, but with awareness, noting how he avoided certain corridors of conversation, how his jaw tightened when a particular former executive was mentioned, how his eyes lingered on the city at night, as if measuring distance from something he could not outrun. And one evening, while reviewing documents together for a public appearance, Emily noticed a discrepancy in a report summary, a figure that had been adjusted without explanation, and she asked about it calmly, not accusatory, just curious, and Alex froze. Only for a second, but it was enough, and he replied with a practiced explanation about restructuring and market volatility, and she accepted it outwardly, but inwardly she noted the repetition. The way his answers mirrored the language she had read below, and later, alone in her room, Emily realized. The significance of what she had uncovered was not merely corporate. It was moral, because the decisions that built this empire had not been victimless. They had been efficient, and efficiency often erased people quietly. And she thought about her own past, about how systems failed those without leverage, and she wondered how many lives had been redirected by choices made in rooms like the one she now shared. And the weight of that understanding pressed against the boundaries of the contract she had signed, because while she had agreed not to interfere, she had not agreed to be blind. And as days passed, Emily began to document her observations privately, not to expose, not yet, but to understand, to ensure that what she perceived was grounded in truth rather than assumption. And with every confirmed detail, the picture sharpened, revealing a confession waiting to be spoken, a truth that had been managed instead of addressed, and Emily felt the quiet certainty that this knowledge would not remain inert, because truth rarely does. And as she stood one night by the same window where Alex had once spoken of pressure and legacy, she understood the full cost of the role she had accepted, that being close enough to power meant being close enough to consequence, and that the marriage, once a means of survival, had become the channel through which accountability might finally enter a dynasty built on silence. And Emily knew that when the moment came, when the truth demanded voice, there would be no contract strong enough to contain it, because once seen, it could not be unseen, and once understood, it would ask something of her in return. The tension did not arrive with confrontation, but with a change in atmosphere, subtle at first, like a drop in temperature that only the observant notice. And Emily felt it during a family dinner when a man she had not met before took the seat across from her. Introduced as Richard Whitmore, Alex's uncle, a senior advisor whose smile never reached his eyes, and as conversation flowed politely around market forecasts and charitable commitments, Richard's attention lingered on Emily with calculated interest, asking questions that sounded courteous but landed like assessments, where she was from, how she adjusted to life at the top, whether she found the responsibilities overwhelming, and Emily answered calmly, aware that this was not curiosity but positioning, and she noticed how Alex stiffened slightly beside her, his jaw tightening in a way she had come to recognize as restraint. And later that evening, after the guests had left, Alex warned her gently that not everyone welcomed change, that certain members of his family valued tradition above progress, and Emily understood the subtext, that her presence, once a solution, had become a variable. And over the following weeks, Richard appeared more frequently, at meetings, at events, in conversations that seemed to orbit around past decisions, and Emily began to sense an unspoken opposition forming, a quiet resistance that did not challenge Alex directly, but questioned the legitimacy of his choices through implication. And one afternoon, while reviewing correspondence in the study, Emily overheard a phone call through the partially open door, Richard's voice low but firm, suggesting that Alex's recent openness posed unnecessary risk, that stability required discipline, not reflection, and that some truths were better left undisturbed. And Emily froze, realizing that the forces guarding the dynasty were not abstract. They were present, attentive, and prepared to intervene. And that night, when she mentioned the call to Alex, he did not deny it. Instead he sighed, the weight of years evident in the simple exhale, explaining that Richard had been instrumental during the critical years, that his methods were effective but unforgiving, and that crossing him was never simple. And Emily listened, understanding now that the antagonist was not a single secret but a system of protection built around it, upheld by those who believed that outcomes justified means, and the realization sharpened her resolve, because she had lived on the other side of those outcomes, and she knew the cost of decisions made without accountability. And as rumors began to circulate quietly within the company, questions about Emily's influence, her access, her role, she recognized the tactic: discredit the messenger to preserve the message, and rather than retreat, Emily responded with consistency, maintaining professionalism, supporting Alex publicly while continuing her private documentation, because clarity was her shield. And one evening, during a tense board meeting where Richard questioned the direction of recent initiatives, implying distraction and vulnerability, Emily spoke up calmly, referencing data, community impact, long-term trust, reframing the conversation without accusation, and the room fell silent, not because she was wrong, but because she was unexpected. And Richard studied her then, truly studied her, and Emily met his gaze without apology. And afterward, Alex thanked her quietly, acknowledging the risk she had taken, and she replied honestly, saying that silence would only deepen the fracture he was trying to mend. And as they stood together, united outwardly yet surrounded by unseen opposition, Emily understood that the conflict had moved beyond discovery. It had entered resistance, because the truth she had uncovered was no longer dormant. It was being guarded against, and that meant it mattered. And as the night settled over the city, Emily felt the full weight of her position, trapped not by the marriage itself, but by the moment history had chosen her as a catalyst. Because when a dynasty senses its foundation might crack, it does not yield quietly. And she knew the path ahead would require courage measured not in confrontation, but in persistence, and that whatever confession lay ahead, it would not emerge without challenge, because the greatest threat to power is not rebellion, it is accountability, and Emily Carter had stepped directly into its path. The confession did not come as an explosion but as an implosion, quiet, controlled, devastating in its precision, and it began on a night when the city was wrapped in rain and the penthouse felt unusually small, because Emily had reached the point where silence became heavier than truth, and she asked Alex to sit with her, not as his wife by contract, but as the one person who had seen both his strength and his fractures. And she spoke calmly, laying out what she had learned without accusation. The archived minutes, the adjusted figures, the erased timelines, the way charity contributions aligned with settlements that no longer carried names. And as she spoke, Alex did not interrupt, his face unreadable at first, then slowly tightening, not with anger but with resignation. And when she finished, the space between them filled with a stillness so complete it felt deliberate. And finally Alex spoke, his voice steady but stripped of its usual armor, admitting that the acquisition everyone praised had been rushed through under extraordinary pressure, that a failing subsidiary threatened to expose vulnerabilities that could have collapsed the company, that advisors, including Richard, insisted decisive action was necessary, and that he had signed approvals knowing they would displace hundreds quietly, legally, efficiently, people absorbed into systems without recourse. And he said he told himself it was temporary, that survival justified sacrifice, that once stability was secured, amends could be made through philanthropy, through growth, through progress. And Emily listened, hearing not excuses but the anatomy of compromise. And Alex continued, admitting that once the empire stabilized, the truth became inconvenient, that acknowledging harm would unravel trust, that silence felt safer than accountability, and he confessed that the marriage had been part of that same instinct, a way to project continuity, to quiet speculation, to maintain control while the past remained buried. And Emily felt the weight of the words settle, because this was the confession she had sensed waiting beneath every polished surface, not criminal in spectacle, but moral in consequence. And she asked him why he was telling her now, and Alex answered simply that he was tired of carrying it alone, that her presence had disrupted the balance he relied on, not through defiance but through clarity. And he admitted that the dynasty he protected had cost more than he ever publicly acknowledged, and that the cost had names, even if he never spoke them. And as the rain traced lines down the glass outside, Emily realized the ruin described in the prophecy of this moment was not physical destruction. It was reputational, ethical, irreversible, because once spoken, the confession could not be returned to silence. And she told Alex that truth did not require spectacle to be devastating, that accountability did not mean erasing what had been built, but redefining what deserved to stand. And Alex closed his eyes briefly, understanding the implication that confession would fracture alliances, invite scrutiny, dismantle the protective myths that had sustained the Whitmore name. And yet, when he opened his eyes, there was a resolve there that Emily had not seen before, a readiness not to defend but to face. And he said that if the dynasty fell, it would fall honestly, not propped up by omissions, and Emily felt the gravity of that choice, because confession would not only ruin his legacy as it existed, it would redefine him entirely. And as they sat together in the quiet aftermath of truth, Emily understood that this was the point of no return, not because the secret had been uncovered, but because it had been owned, and in owning it, Alex had relinquished the illusion of control that had shaped his life. And the rain continued outside, steady, relentless, washing the city without judgment, as two people sat at the center of an empire poised to change, knowing that dawn would bring consequences measured not in dollars or stock prices, but in the courage to accept what comes after honesty, because the confession had not destroyed the dynasty yet, but it had stripped it of its armor, and nothing would ever stand the same again. The consequences began before morning, not with sirens or shouting, but with messages that arrived quietly and multiplied. Emails marked urgent, calls missed then repeated, notifications that hinted at questions spreading faster than answers. And Emily watched Alex move through the penthouse with a focus she had not seen before, no longer managing appearances, but preparing for accountability. And when dawn broke over the city, the light revealed a man who had chosen a direction that could not be reversed, because the confession he had spoken to her demanded action, and action demanded exposure. And within hours, counsel was summoned, statements drafted then rewritten, and Alex listened without defensiveness as advisors outlined risks measured in stock volatility, regulatory review, and reputational damage, while Richard's voice cut through the calm with sharp insistence that restraint was still possible, that silence could be restored with careful framing, that loyalty to legacy required discipline, not disclosure. And Alex met his uncle's gaze evenly and declined, stating that stability built on omission was no longer acceptable, and the room stilled, because refusal was rare, and Emily felt the shift register not only in policy but in power, as Alex chose transparency over protection. And as the day unfolded, the market reacted predictably, confidence wavered, analysts speculated, headlines softened then sharpened, and Emily understood that this was the moment where most people retreat, where self-preservation whispers louder than conscience. And she felt the weight of her own position press in, because she could step away now, protected by the contract's exit clauses, her needs secured, her future intact, and no one would fault her for choosing distance. And that option tempted her, because survival had taught her the value of timely exits. But survival had also taught her the cost of silence. And as Alex prepared to address the board, Emily asked to speak with him privately, and she told him that accountability would be hollow if it stopped at confession, that repair required participation, not performance. And Alex agreed, acknowledging that the path forward would require independent review, restitution efforts guided by those affected, and a willingness to accept outcomes he could not control. And when he asked her what she intended to do, Emily paused, recognizing the gravity of her answer, and she said she would stay, not as a shield, not as an ornament, but as a witness and a partner in rebuilding, because walking away would preserve her comfort but abandon the truth she had helped surface. And Alex nodded, accepting the condition without assumption. And later, as the company released a statement acknowledging past harms and committing to corrective action, Emily felt the ground shift beneath the dynasty, not collapsing but realigning, and the reaction was immediate. Some allies withdrew, others emerged unexpectedly. Voices long unheard found space to speak, and the noise was relentless, but within it was a clarity that had been absent for years. And as night fell again, Emily stood beside Alex at the window, the city unchanged yet newly honest in her eyes. And she reflected on how far she had come from counting coins at a kitchen table to standing at the center of a reckoning. And she understood that justice rarely arrives cleanly, that repair is slower than damage. But she also knew that choosing to remain present was itself an act of courage, because it meant bearing witness to the consequences of truth without the comfort of distance. And as Alex thanked her for staying, she replied that staying was not loyalty to a person or a name, but to the principle that power must answer to people. And in that quiet exchange, Emily recognized the transformation underway, not just of a company, but of a marriage that had begun as a deal and evolved into a commitment to do what was right, even when it cost more than either of them had planned. Because the dynasty might survive in a different form or it might not, but the choice to face the truth had already redefined what legacy could mean, and Emily Carter stood ready to see it through, not because she was trapped, but because she had chosen to be there when accountability finally mattered. The weeks that followed were quieter in volume, but heavier in meaning, because once the initial shock passed, the real work began, and Emily found herself immersed in efforts that felt less like damage control and more like repair, meeting with community representatives, listening to stories that had been displaced by corporate language, watching Alex sit across from people without titles or leverage and hear what efficiency had cost them. And through it all, the marriage shifted again, no longer a public shield, but a private partnership forged through shared responsibility. And Emily noticed the change in Alex not as grand gestures, but as habits. The way he arrived early to meetings he once delegated, the way he asked questions without steering answers, the way he stopped speaking in absolutes, and she understood that accountability had softened him without weakening him. And one evening, after a long day spent reviewing the framework for an independent restitution initiative, Alex asked Emily to walk with him through the city. No security detail, no press, just the two of them moving through streets that felt more real than boardrooms ever had. And as they walked, he spoke about fear, not of losing wealth or status, but of losing the right to be believed. And Emily told him that belief was not granted by power but earned through consistency. And he nodded, absorbing the truth with a humility that still surprised her. And when they returned home, the penthouse no longer felt like a fortress, but like a place finally inhabited. And that night, Alex asked Emily to sit with him, not to discuss strategy or optics, but to talk about them. And he acknowledged what they both knew but had not yet named, that the contract which had brought them together no longer defined what they had become. That trust had replaced obligation, that choice had replaced necessity, and he told her he would understand if she wanted to leave, because the path ahead would remain difficult, and she deserved the freedom that had been deferred too long. And Emily considered the offer, not lightly, because freedom mattered to her, but she also recognized the truth of her own heart, that staying was no longer an act of survival, but of commitment. And she told him she did not want to be bound by a document that assumed distance, that if they continued, it should be without conditions, without timelines, without clauses designed to protect appearances. And Alex listened, then reached into a drawer and placed the original contract on the table between them, the paper that had once felt heavier than winter air. And without ceremony, he tore it cleanly in half, then again, until it was nothing more than fragments. And in that moment, the sound of paper tearing felt more decisive than any vow. And he took the ring from her hand, the one chosen for symbolism rather than sentiment, and set it aside, then retrieved another, simpler, unremarkable in price but deliberate in meaning. And he asked her, without cameras, without witnesses, without leverage, if she would choose him now, knowing the flaws, the cost, the work ahead. And Emily felt the weight of that question not as pressure but as possibility, because for the first time, there was no advantage to be gained, no safety net attached, only the choice itself. And she answered yes, not because the path was easy, but because it was honest. And as he placed the ring on her finger, it felt lighter than the first, not because it was smaller, but because it carried no conditions. And they stood together in the quiet that followed, aware that love did not erase consequences or guarantee redemption, but it did offer partnership in facing them. And Emily realized that the greatest transformation of all had not been the fall or rebuilding of a dynasty, but the emergence of a relationship rooted in truth rather than transaction. And as the city hummed outside, steady and indifferent, two people chose each other freely, not as a solution to a problem, but as a commitment to walk forward without hiding, knowing that whatever legacy remained would be shaped not by what they controlled, but by what they were willing to confront together. Time moved forward without ceremony. as it always does after moments that feel final. And Emily learned that resolution was not a single act, but a pattern of choices repeated when no one was watching. And in the months that followed, the Whitmore name no longer carried the same unquestioned authority, but it carried something rarer, credibility earned rather than assumed. And Emily watched Alex step fully into a different kind of leadership, one that accepted limits, welcomed oversight, and measured success not only by growth charts but by the absence of quiet harm. And she stood beside him not as a symbol, but as a partner whose voice mattered, attending community forums where questions were direct and answers were not rehearsed, and listening as people tested sincerity with skepticism that slowly softened into cautious trust. And the work was not glamorous. It was methodical, sometimes uncomfortable, often slow, but it was real, and that reality grounded their relationship in a way no contract ever could. And as the company restructured, shedding some divisions and redefining others, Emily returned to parts of herself she had set aside, enrolling in evening classes focused on ethics and public policy, not because she needed credentials, but because she wanted language equal to the responsibility she now carried. And Alex supported this quietly, not as an enabler, but as an equal who understood that growth was not a threat to partnership. And their home changed too, opening up, filling with conversation and laughter that had once felt out of place, becoming a space that reflected intention rather than insulation. And on a crisp fall morning, Emily walked past the same river she had once overlooked in borrowed heels, noticing how the air felt lighter now, not because life was easier, but because it was no longer divided between who she was and who she pretended to be. And she reflected on how the marriage that had begun as a last resort had revealed her strength rather than consumed it, and how love, when chosen freely, did not erase history but helped carry it honestly. And Alex felt the change as well, speaking openly in an interview about the difference between legacy and responsibility, acknowledging mistakes without deflection. And when asked about the role Emily played in the transformation, he answered simply that she reminded him power existed to serve, not to shield. And Emily did not flinch at the attention, because she had learned that visibility did not have to mean surrendering oneself. And as winter approached again, marking a full year since the night she signed her name beneath terms she no longer lived by, Emily and Alex returned to the museum where their public journey had once been tested, this time not for a gala, but for a modest event unveiling a community-funded initiative shaped by those it served. And as Emily stood there, listening to voices that once would have been absent, she felt a quiet pride settle, not triumph, but alignment. And she realized that justice does not announce itself with finality. It arrives through sustained presence. And the story she once thought was about escape had become one of engagement. And later that evening, as they walked home through streets alive with ordinary moments, Emily considered how easily her life could have gone another way, how close she had come to mistaking security for safety. And she understood now that safety came from truth, from relationships that allowed for growth without control. And when Alex asked her what she wanted next, she answered without hesitation, saying she wanted to keep choosing the path that asked the most of her, because it was the only one that felt honest. And as they paused beneath a streetlight, the city humming around them, Emily knew that the dynasty she had entered no longer defined her, nor did its fall define him, because what remained was something quieter and stronger, a shared commitment to live without hiding, to love without leverage, and to build a future measured not by what was protected, but by what was made right. And in that certainty, Emily Carter stepped fully into a life no longer shaped by deals or fear, but by the knowledge that dignity, once reclaimed, becomes the foundation upon which everything else can finally stand.